Hello, and welcome everyone to our webinar on tech diplomacy for addressing the global challenge of climate change. I'm Elsa Fredericks, a student at Redwood High School in Larkspur, California, and I've organized this Zoom series with the Tech Diplomacy Network of diplomats from 25 countries. Our speaker, Isabella Tomas, is a co-founder of the Tech Diplomacy Network and serves both as Austria's consul and tech representative to Silicon Valley as co-director of Open Austria. Isabella was previously head of innovation diplomacy in Austria's Ministry for European and International Affairs. She also posted as a diplomat abroad, both in Europe and South America. Isabella will present the international context and important EU policies, as well as Austria's own approach to tech diplomacy. Increasingly, an important element of tech diplomacy for Austria and many other countries is close collaboration with universities and their research. So, we have been fortunate enough to have been able to work on this webinar also with Marcus Zechna, an adjunct professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Marcus is a geological engineer who has worked with a large Austrian oil company on their transition to renewable energy and has a particular focus on applying AI to sustainability. We had so many interesting questions in our last Zoom, and I again encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A button. Now I'll turn it over to you, Isabella.
Thank you, Elsa, and welcome from my part as well, everyone. Happy to be here and happy to talk to you a little bit about a specific part of tech diplomacy, I should say, which is the climate change and facing the challenge of climate change. I am sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see it fine. Yes, Elsa? Okay, great. So before we talk about the tech diplomacy part of climate change, I would like you to look at some of the numbers so we get the facts right about what climate change is about. Of course, it is a very broad topic and there are many aspects of climate change as we could talk about, but due to time constraints, I've picked several examples that I hope will work best for you to get a good idea and a good picture. So the first slide that you see here shows you the historic development of carbon emissions. And again, I know, and I'm guessing most of you also know, that CO2 emissions aren't the only emissions relevant when we talk about climate change, but for sake of simplicity, I have picked them. And you can see, I hope, fairly well in the graph, the different world regions, Europe, South America, the US, China, etc. And with the colors, it's actually quite, I think, clear to see how the CO2 emissions developed in every region. You can see how they were largest in Europe and the US already at the beginning of the 20th century, how they have grown a lot in the second half of the 20th century, and how, for example, in Europe, they have actually started to decrease slightly, starting probably in the 90s. How in the US, they have maintained a relatively same level throughout the last probably 30, 40 years. How in China, they have grown significantly. And same is also true for India. And how other parts of the world, such as South America, Africa, although they have a significant share of the global population, they do not emit by far as much as, for example, Europe, the US, and China does. So we have really some regions that concentrate most of the world's emissions too. The second graph I'd like to show you is to put it a bit in proportion, so to speak, the relation between carbon emissions and the GDP, so the gross domestic product. Basically looking at what wealth does in a state to the emissions. And I hope you can see it quite clearly. If you're looking from right to left, the wealthier a nation gets, the wealthier its citizens are, the more they emit, the higher their energy consumption is, and that at the same time means that they produce more emissions. You can see on the very top left up Qatar, a very small state, of course, but very rich in gas and fossil fuels. So although this population is really almost negligible on a worldwide scale, they are the number one emitter in per capita. The United States is not far behind, as you can see, and then Austria is also Austria, the country where I come from, although a very small country, but a per capita emission is fairly high. So this is a typical, you could say, element for our Western European or even Western world in general countries. While on the other end of the scale, you see a couple of examples like Niger in Africa or Haiti in the Caribbean. They do not emit as by far as much as we wealthier countries do. If we look at which sectors, which industries, where the emissions really come from, I just picked three examples there. One is the US because, you know, this is the place you know best. And you can see from the statistics of our World in Data that the three sectors that produce most emissions, most CO2 emissions in the US are the electricity and heat sector. So if you think of course, heating, but also of everything, air conditioning and all the electricity you use in private houses, commercial use, industry, etc. So that's the number one. Number two, by not far behind, is transport. So all we see on the road every day, all those nice traffic jams that I had to go through today too when I came back from the South Bay to San Francisco, etc., etc. So that's a number two. And a number three, in the case of the US, is buildings. I will come back to that a bit later. If you compare Europe, let me just, yes. If you compare the European Union, I have to say to be perfectly correct, so the 27 member states of the European Union on your right, it's exactly the same. So we see electricity and heat number one, we see transport number two, and we see buildings number three. Maybe the difference is not as large as in the US. Electricity and heat and transport are not that much in front, but they still are number one and number two sector of emitters. If we just look at my small home country of Austria, here transport is actually the number one emitter. So you could argue that we're doing particularly bad in the field of transport, which is not entirely wrong, but we are also actually doing quite well in the part of electricity and heating, meaning that we are trying, and that's what I meant when I said that the building sector in the US was the number three. What we're trying is having buildings constructed in a way that they are very well isolated, that they need a minimum amount of heating, really, although we have very cold winters, you know, Lake Tahoe cold like, and that air conditioning is also not always necessary because of the building's isolation. So that actually does a lot when we talk about climate change, the way that we build all our buildings, actually, you know, private and commercial. So when I said earlier that Qatar was number one in the list of states' emissions per capita and per GDP, I mentioned that they were rich in gas and other fossil fuels. So in order to be very clear about which sources of energy produce most emissions, I have these two graphs for you. So the one on the left, tells you about the global primary energy consumption by source. So meaning what do people actually use around the world to get their energy from? So you see that oil is on top of that, followed by coal, and number three, gas. Then there is a very, very big gap, and we reach hydropower, biomass, nuclear, wind, solar, and other renewables. So you can see that the three top sources of energy are all what we call and what is usually referred to as fossil fuels. On the graph on the right of the slide, you can see how these sources of energy affect the environment in the sense that how much do they emit? Because it's not the same to use oil, to use coal, to use gas, or nuclear power to produce your electricity and your energy. So the number one emitter in terms of gram per kilowatt hour is brown coal. So specific kind of coal. Number two is hard coal. So we could just say coal in general is what emits most by far. Gas comes in second after coal with already quite, you could say just half actually of CO2 equivalents if you use gas to fire electricity. So it's only half as bad for the environment, but still significantly worse, almost 4 times as bad as nuclear energy. And then nuclear again is almost 4 times as bad as photovoltaic energy. And the best in that sense, those energy sources that cause less emissions are the onshore and the offshore wind farms and the hydropower. Okay. So now that we know that coal is the worst energy source to cause CO2 emissions in the world, I've prepared these two graphs for you to get hopefully quite a clear idea about where in the world coal is most consumed, where coal is most used in order to produce electricity. So as you can see on the graph on your left, China is the number one country in the world to use coal as electricity source, followed by India, which is, a problem because these are also the two states with the highest population in the whole world. So this is a lot of people using coal as source of electricity. And then after India, kind of coming in third place, you could say, is already the US. So you still use quite a lot of coal as energy sources. Then all the other countries already are have a significant decrease or do not use coal at all. Because we have known for quite some time, several decades actually, that coal is the worst energy source when we look at CO2 emissions, there have been a lot of international initiatives to source or phase out coal power, to stop using coal as a source of energy altogether. And the right slide tells you which countries have pledged, so have committed themselves to not use coal anymore as energy source altogether. So you can see Canada there that has committed itself to phase out coal by 2030, so in 6 years' time. Several Western European states have done the same. Other countries, such as actually Poland and also Germany, have pledged to phase out coal by 2040 or sometime in the 2040s in that decade. Same is true for Indonesia and Thailand. However, you see that a big part of the world, such as the US, Mexico, Brazil, China, India, Russia, Australia, have not pledged anything relating to coal. So they have, at least for now, not stated any intentions to phase out coal power. So if you compare the two world maps, well, I think it is quite obvious that we still have a problem, because although many countries have pledged to not use coal anymore, those who use it most have not committed themselves yet to any of that. When we so sorry for the last slide, which was rather pessimistic. I was trying to find optimistic examples, positive developments in the field of climate. And when we look at climate change, very soon it became clear that the way we have been doing things over the last decades, or almost centuries, you could say, will not lead us to a bright future, rather the contrary. So we have sort of the world community, could say, have agreed that innovation and new technologies will be needed for us in order to be able to maintain what you could say is the lifestyle we are used to in terms of energy availability, etc. by using new technologies. And so significant amounts of finance and efforts have been going to what is seen considered as solutions for this greener and brighter future of ours. So I have just taken two examples, which I hope show it quite well. One on the left side is the world price for lithium-ion batteries and how it has developed from 2013 until 2023. As I guess all of you know, those batteries are very relevant when we look at electric vehicle production, but the same is true for most of the electronic devices that we are all using probably on a daily basis. So if you compare the cost of those 10 years ago, or 11 years ago rather, in 2013 and 2023, you can see that it has gone down significantly. It's basically a fifth or even less than that of the price it used to be 11 years ago. And that, of course, also means that those technologies, such as electric vehicles, have become much cheaper and have become more accessible to bigger parts of the population. Price and cost, of course, is always a big element when we talk about climate change, because many countries say, well, you know, this is all great that you have these new technologies, but they're just too expensive. We can't afford them. So we just have to continue the way we used to with coal or oil or gas, because this transition is just more than we can bear. So technology is usually seen as the argument against that, and saying that technology will develop and while it develops, it will become cheaper. So the right side slide shows you that really the costs of energy per kilowatt hour, and it compares all kinds of renewable energy sources, because these are the ones that we're trying to increase. These are the ones that we're trying to use much more than we do today, and actually much more than we do fossil fuel energy sources. So luckily, as you can see, all of them have actually gone down in terms of price, especially the concentrated solar power, but also the photovoltaic, as well as the offshore winds and the hydropower. So that means that if you compare it with 14 years ago, to install a photovoltaic or solar power, well, if you would like to call it factory, although I don't find that very fitting, the price has gone down by 75%, basically. So this is really the encouraging part. And because prices have been gone down, there is always hope that this will continue to go down. However, it might be a matter of timing as well, because technology only gets us so far. And at some point, we will have to kind of make the leap and commit to all these new technologies instead of waiting for them to become even cheaper and even cheaper and even cheaper, because at some point, it just may be too late. So that too late point, for that not to happen, in Europe, and Austria is a member of the European Union, some 4 years ago, the current European Commission, you could argue the government of the European Union, has come up with a plan. And this plan they have called the European Green Deal, meaning that Europe has set itself very ambitious goals in order to fight climate change. If you remember the very first slide of this presentation, you could see that Europe actually at some point had the biggest chunk of carbon emissions around the world compared with all other countries. We know that, and we recognize that, and we recognize our, say, role that we have to play, and how we should actually go forward with reducing the emissions before other countries do, because we are the ones who have most. As part of the European Green Deal, or you could actually see the European Green Deal as a consequence of what happened in the Paris Agreement in 2015. I suppose most of you have heard about it. I will still just repeat the main points so that we're all on the same page. So the Paris Agreement was reached during the COP21, COP being the Conference of the Parties, which is a yearly gathering on the topic of climate change. 196 states were present, so you could argue almost all states around the world were there. And what they've agreed on was to limit the temperature increase worldwide to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. If somebody can say that in Fahrenheit, because I'm very bad with that, but maybe the 1.5 degrees Celsius is fine. So that means that the greenhouse gas emissions must peak before 2025, meaning this year, as we're talking, and next year should be the highest amounts of emissions that the world, all the countries taken together emit. After 2025, it has to go down. It cannot continue to grow, because otherwise we will reach the so-called point of no return. And the goal that was also set forth in the Paris Agreement in order to reach this not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase was that we have to reduce our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, sorry, by 43% until 2030. So this is only 6 years away. This is not very far away. And 43% is a lot. It's almost half of all the energy we use. So this all happened in 2015. Of course, when these big conferences happen and then big agreements are being reached, and as the case in the Paris Agreement, the goal was set for 2030, it does not go on year after year, and then in 2030 people come together again and just look at their data. That's not how it works, because we all know if a lot of time happens, people tend to forget, other people come into place, other politicians come along, etc., etc. So there are yearly commitments, yearly reports that every country who is a part to the Paris Agreement, and it's almost all of the world, have to actually hand in, and they have to show what they have done, and they have to show where they are on their path to the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because, as I said earlier, and because you've seen on the first slide with Europe, the US, China, India being bigger emitters than the others, not every country, of course, will have to reduce their emissions by 43%. That is all the world put together. Because we're not starting from square one, we are in very different positions. Europe and the US, you could argue, are already on square 10, while others are on -2. So what has been determined 5 years after the Paris Agreement were the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions to this goal of reducing emissions by 43% by 2030. So this happened 2015. Then 2020, the European Union came up with a European Green Deal and said, we have all committed to the Paris Agreement. However, within Europe, we want to go into more detail and we want to reach our goal even earlier. So what the main goals of these so-called European Green Deals are that Europe wants to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. What does climate neutral mean? That doesn't mean that we do not emit any greenhouse gas emissions anymore, because that would probably be impossible. But as you probably know, emissions can happen, and then there are ways to actually capture these emissions again. There are natural ways, such as photosynthesis, that all plants are doing. So if you have more trees, more plants, etc., the emissions that will come from parts of your sectors will be grabbed and will be sort of reintroduced as oxygen into the air and will not be a problem for climate change anymore. So that's what Europe is trying to reach. What needs to be done for that on the way until 2050 is that at least 55% of our net greenhouse gases will have to be reduced by 2030. So again, in only 6 years' time. Reduced, that is always compared to the levels of 1990. This is kind of like the base level year that we have agreed on. Also, because, as I said, climate neutral doesn't mean there are no emissions anymore, the EU has set as a goal that 3 billion of additional trees should be planted in the European Union by the year of 2030 in order to capture all those emissions that are coming from our industry, transport, etc. So what the Commission has said when they presented this European Green Deal was that it should serve to protect, conserve, and enhance the EU's natural capital and protect the health and well-being of citizens from environment-related risk and impacts. There are many of them, the environment-related risks. It's not just the rise of the temperature, it's also the air quality, many illnesses that are related to what happens with climate change, etc., etc. So the focal areas, as you can imagine, and as we've seen on earlier slides, are those sectors that are mainly responsible for our emissions, such as the energy sector. Those fossil fuels will have to be phased out, or we will not manage to reach the goal of 75% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. Also the buildings, the energy consumption when we actually build a house will have to be reduced, which is quite a challenge actually, because two sectors that when they produce emit most CO2 are the steel and the cement sector. And usually both are being needed for the construction of houses. So that's why we are looking at alternative material such as wood or other recycled material. And I will come back to that later in the presentation. But this at first looked almost impossible to achieve. However, we're fairly on a good track now, I should say. The industry in general right now only uses 12% of recycled materials. This has definitely have to go up, be it glass bottles, be it plastic, be it all kind of wrappings. Other materials will have to be found or already have been found, but will have to be used more in order to reach these goals. One of the initiatives within the European Green Deal is called Repower EU. So this really focuses on the electricity production. So to give you a little bit of background, you all know, of course, that in February 2022, Russia started a full-fledged invasion to Ukraine. What that did to Europe, of course, was at first a big scare, because this is very close to home. It actually is home. Ukraine's part of Europe. And it also meant that our primary gas provider, Russia, was now suddenly attacking another country on the continent. So countries such as Austria and also Germany and most of the Eastern European member states of the EU have been heavily dependent on Russian gas for their heating, for their industry, etc., etc. So when the invasion started, we have done a big we have made big efforts in order to reduce this dependency. We have managed to reduce our demand by 20%, and in less than 8 months, we have also managed to replace that gas that came through the pipelines from Russia by other gas sources, actually also gas from the US, gas from Norway, etc. And what this has done to Europe in general is it, of course, meant that our prices went way up. The Russian pipeline gas was fairly cheap compared to gas, LNG that we had to get from faraway places, agreements that had to be made with other countries, other sources that had to be found, etc. So the prices went up. Just yesterday, we had a meeting here in San Francisco with the European Commissioner for Financial Markets and Financial Stability and Sustainable Financing, and she was talking about that too. And she said, well, we have managed that the lights did not go out in Europe that winter after the Russian invasion, but the prices went up, and that hurts, of course. So the ultimate goal is not to be dependent on gas from nowhere, so to say. And so again, it is the increase in renewable energies that is seen as part of the solution. This has already been agreed on before 2022. However, that year and also 2023 have given the whole development a huge boost. And now, right now, we are at 39% of electricity from renewables. Excuse me, that was in 2022. Right now, we are actually higher than that. And the goal to achieve until 2030 is 80%. So we're still on a good track for a strange reason, because the invasion was, of course, not meant to boost the European renewable energy industry, but it did still. The other part of the strategy is science, science research development. And the program that finances all this is called Horizon Europe. So the idea behind that is that we need new technologies, we need innovative technologies, and we need it wherever we can get it. Europe has around 500 million inhabitants, but of course, compared to the world, that's almost nothing. We only are 6% of the world's population. Although we produce 17% of the global research and development and 25% of all the high quality scientific publications, so we're punching above our weight, you could argue, it is still by no means enough to solve this challenge of climate change that we want to solve. And then, of course, as you know, emissions don't know no borders. So we all have to work together on this. And that's what Horizon Europe is for, so that the best researchers from anywhere in the world and the brightest minds can connect and can get funding for their research that will hopefully benefit us all. The symbol you see on the top of the right is the logo of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So these 17 goals have already been agreed on by all of the UN members in order to achieve a more sustainable future. So that is another important goal for the Horizon Europe research. The research should be dedicated to reach these UN Sustainable Development Goals that we have all committed ourselves to. And as you can see, the 5 main areas for this research, number 1 is already adaptation to climate change, including the societal transformations that come with it. I will just very quickly say that climate, energy, and mobility is then part of the second pillar of the Horizon Europe program, with the other pillars receiving funding in different areas. And reach just the smallest level, being Austria, my home country. I had to get some data on us as well, because I was actually interested in myself. We have actually pledged to reach climate neutrality by 2040. So that means 10 years earlier than the European Union as a whole. We want to be super ambitious. Our emission reduction goal is minus 36% compared to 1990 levels. I'm saying our goal because, of course, as I've just said earlier about the Paris Agreement, not every country starts at square one. So every country within the EU had a specific goal allocated. So ours is minus 36%. The good news in that is the chart on the left with the blue bars, where you can see that Austria is actually world leader in terms of share of hydroelectric power. We are lucky enough to have the geography to be able to benefit from hydroelectric power plants, and we produce a lot of our energy with hydroelectric power, much more than all our other European fellow countries and as all our countries around the world. So that is good news, because if you remember the slide about how much emissions gram per kilowatt hour every energy source produces, well, hydroelectric power was the lowest of all. On the other hand, the less good news, so to speak, is the yellow graph that I looked up because I was actually curious. Living here in San Francisco in the Bay Area, of course, gives you another idea of how many electric vehicles are there on the road. Well, in Austria, it's clearly not the same as it is here. In February 2024, so that was really the latest number I could get, only 17% of newly registered cars in Austria were electric vehicles, BEV meaning battery electric vehicles. So our goal set by the government until 2030 was actually that 100% of newly registered cars should be electric. So you can see we still have a long way to go there. Right now, 161,500 cars roughly are electric, those that circulate around Austria. We have a population of 9 million, so you can guess that this is also not a very big share. It's actually, I think, only 3% of all the vehicles that are in circulation. And also our recharging points that are in operation are not enough, by far not enough, which is by many people mentioned as an obstacle. Other than the price, the cost of the car itself is the infrastructure for charging. But then I guess you know that story already from places in the US as well. So what we have to do as good member of the European Union is we have to hand in our national energy and climate plan every year. Every 2 years. They are being submitted by Brussels. They're being undergoing review, very strict review. Then every country receives recommendations back, and then you're allowed to correct your plans and to send it in again. It's not only a matter of government. It's actually mandatory to consult the citizens, to consult the private sector, businesses, and also regional authorities when you draft and write this energy and climate plan. So you can see the graph on the right, a lot of numbers and lots of colors of priorities and different sectors. So we're really trying to consider everything and take everything into account, including, in the case of Austria, a climate youth council that has been established for exactly that purpose. And it has met 3 times so far. The last was just happened last week. 100 young people that are being chosen by some kind of lottery between 14 and 30 years, exchange their ideas and their concerns on climate policy issues and discuss them with members of parliament, actually. Everything I've told you so far was more about the climate change part than about the tech diplomacy part. So for the second part, what can we actually do? You know, us as diplomats, what we do here at Open Austria in San Francisco is that we, of course, try to connect Austria and the Silicon Valley because it is, and it will be the hub of global innovation. So when we look at what I've mentioned earlier, these new technologies that will be needed in order to tackle challenges such as climate change, here is the place to look. As representatives of the Republic of Austria, we are the eyes and ears of the country. So we try to find out as much as possible about what is going on. And a big part of that is, of course, also the academic research that Elsa mentioned earlier. So we reach out regularly to the research institutions, to the universities here in the Bay Area, as well as companies in the private sector that work in that field. So this is just for you to get an idea of our projects and the events we organize and the fields we work in. We are trying to engage with a lot of different stakeholders, other countries, institutions, think tanks, private businesses here in the Bay Area to find out what the latest technology looks like, what could be achieved in a couple of years' time, and what could be of interest for Austria, as well as the other way around. What we have in Austria in some parts, as I've mentioned, world-class hydroelectric power, for example, and we're also quite good at wind power, could be of interest for the state of California or the US. So that is the part where diplomacy comes in. It is not so much about knowing exactly how the technology works, because of course, unfortunately, we cannot all be world-class engineers. That's what we have the academia and the research institutions for. But we have to, so to say, know the right people. We have to know what they're working on, and we have to know what the best fit for us and for our country would be. One of the main projects that Open Austria does every year is the so-called Go USA program. That means Austrian startups can apply and can come here to San Francisco, to Boston, and to Atlanta to show what they have been working on, to show their products, to showcase themselves. I have mentioned two here that have already been part of this program, like Novations and Carbony, that are Austrian startups that work in the field of sustainability. Just to mention that they exist. And so what we're trying to do is help them get their projects here on the market, help them show what they're able to do. Other than that, we are a part, as Elsa has already mentioned, of the Tech Diplomacy Network, which has also been explained by Martin in the last presentation. But it means that we have the possibility to engage with these other companies from around the Bay Area that may be market leaders in their fields. So if we want to know what really happens, what they're really working on, what they're really researching on, well, we have to talk to them and we have to reach out to them, which is exactly what the diplomacy in general is about. So these were the two examples I've mentioned. This is not to do any commercial for them, but because they're really doing great stuff in the field of sustainability, finding, for example, as a case of Lignovations, finding new material and powerful alternatives to those that still require fossil-based ingredients. So when you think of building, for example, cement, steel, etc., they have already also been my participant in the Startup World Cup and made it to San Francisco because San Francisco always hosts the final every year. So this is a cool place to go in case you're interested in startups from everywhere around the world that have been chosen as the best of the best out of their countries. Every year in San Francisco, that happens. And Carbony, the other one, it does not produce new material, but they actually help you to look at what you are doing as a company and your production and try to give you a decarbonized plan. So basically, they come up with a plan for you how to reduce your emissions. So both ways are different and are perfectly valuable in order to achieve what the common goal in our case should be, which is tackling of the climate change. So I'll stop here because I want to give room and time for questions. Over to you, Elsa.
Thank you, Isabella, so much for that overview of the challenges and opportunities for tech diplomacy in sustainability. I've seen a lot of great questions. So the first one I wanted to ask was, how frequent are international research collaborations on these new sustainability technologies?
Very, very frequent. Daily, I'd say. There is hardly a researcher at any university I know, either here or in Austria, that would not work on something like that. In many fields, be it the field of energy, being the field of we actually have two Austrians at Stanford University. One working at exactly that, the improvement of batteries and their saving energies, and the other one working on geothermal energy as a non-fossil source. Also, carbon capture and storage, I think, is quite a big topic because all those CO2 emissions that are up there in the air at some point, ideally, we would not only emit less, but we would also be able to get what is already out there, well, back, so to speak, out of the atmosphere and store it away somewhere where it can do no harm. I know that I think that Finland has already introduced a carbon capture and storage system in the very, very northern parts where they drilled holes, 50-meter deep holes to capture carbon there. So there's lots of innovation going on, and I'm sure if you talk to people responsible for Horizon Europe, for example, they will easily be giving you a dozen examples of other projects.
The next question is, does EU funding for sustainability projects mean companies or institutions from different European countries need to be coordinated with one another?
Yes. Yes, that's what it means. The easy answer is yes. Usually, you would have to check the criteria, but usually the EU would only fund projects that are being coordinated with more than 2 different states. So just one state, even if it's a European Union member, could not just hand in a project, be it for sustainability or other, and request funding. That would not go through because what the EU wants to achieve, as I just said, is that the maximum amount of countries collaborate in order to achieve the best outcome. And it is considered that more people who collaborate will come up with more and better ideas. And third countries, which is how we call everyone who's not a EU member state, can also be included. So it could be, say, 2 European Union countries, 1 Latin American country, and the US. Not a problem. That would all work. That would all get funding.
Also, you showed how countries use more energy per capita as they are in the industrialization process. Does the EU work with countries of the global south who are industrializing to support more climate-friendly energy use?
Yes, we do. It is actually uh, one of the priorities of our official development aid. So the EU is the biggest donor of the world if you take all the 27 countries combined. And renewable energy, for example, is one of the priorities. So we are trying to work with them to help them install and use and benefit from these new energy sources. There are several other ways, for example, sustainable agriculture, introduction of, well, actually food and crops to be used in the global south. And well, I could look up some other projects if you want, but the short answer is definitely yes.
And a follow-up question that I have is that China has built up a lot of coal-based plants because coal is so cheap. How do you think other developing countries can best be discouraged from using coal?
That really is the $1 million question, because that's what we're all trying to do. It is very difficult to discourage a country to take the cheapest and on first sight easiest solution. And of course, there is such a thing as national sovereignty. So every country is entitled to choose its own energy sources. To put it bluntly, they don't have to listen. But of course, that is part of the art of diplomacy, even the classic diplomacy, not only the tech diplomacy, is to make other countries listen and find out how you get them to listen, give them examples, support them. Sometimes it can even be by pressure. There are many ways, and you would have to look at on a case by case, I'd say, but it is definitely where we all want to end up at, so to speak, discouraging all the others. Right now, of course, we can say, well, look at the consequences. Climate change is not something that is far away in the future. It's already happening. It has been happening over the last years. So you can see the consequences very clearly almost anywhere in the world, be it because the summers are hotter, be it because there's not enough snow anymore in the winter, because there's not enough rain, because the sea level rises, because there's less fish, because the sea temperature is also rising. There are more natural disasters, etc., etc. It's not very difficult to show these consequences. So it will be increasingly difficult for those countries who do not want to commit or who do not want to pledge to get away with that, because there is such a thing as group pressure, even when you look at the world states community as a group. And that's what we're trying to do. But no one can be forced.
And lastly, the EU has announced more ambitious climate goals for 2040, as you described, but it seems to have gotten a lot of economic pushback. For example, I've read from farmers. How is the EU addressing its citizens' concerns, do you think?
Yes, that is very true. I think there are even farmers' protests in Brussels today, again, and there have been in Paris and there have been in Germany, etc. And yes, actually, the EU commissioner I was in a meeting with yesterday mentioned the same thing, mentioned that uh, the financing part right now is the biggest challenge. So people have agreed on goals and that we want to reach that, but there are more and more reluctant in actually putting, what would you say, putting the money where the mouth is. So yeah, exactly, giving those funds that are really needed. Uh, Partly because when the Green Deal was decided upon 4 years ago, we did not have no pandemic yet. It was decided before that. There was no Russian invasion to Ukraine. There were no other global crises that are being going on that have required attention and that have required funding. So you could argue that countries have used part of the money that was actually needed in order to address climate change, and use it for other purposes that had been seen as more pressing, more immediately pressing. There is going to be a need of finding new sources of financing. Actually, I believe that the EU is looking beyond its borders, that we're also trying to find financing everywhere, including in the US, for projects that are also being, as I've tried to show in the slides, increasingly economically viable. So it's not so much anymore about, well, we have to pay all that money so that we get renewable energies and that the money will all be lost. That's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to actually also bring profit. It's supposed to work according to market logic. And in many camps, it does. So that's the argument that the EU is now trying to use when they approach other sources of financing, including even, venture capital firms from the Silicon Valley.
I actually have one last question. Do you expect the USA or other countries to show more ambition towards climate change plans? Why do countries not want to pledge to climate change action?
Well, why they don't want to pledge is because they do not want to bear the costs, especially if they are not entirely sure how high this cost will really be. It's kind of a moving target because, as we said, technology develops, prices develop. Right now, they're increasing, but it's not a given that this will continue forever. And so if countries pledge and commit to goals for 2030 or 2040, if you look at it from the perspective of a country's government, most likely they will think, well, we're not going to be around anymore for that, so why should we commit? This won't even be our mandate anymore. So that's kind of like that's kind of part of the issue. The other part is that some countries see it as a matter of, well, we will pledge or we will commit if the others do. So we won't be the first. We probably also don't want to be the last because that doesn't look good, talking about group pressure and all. But we don't want to be the first. We don't want to go forward and bear most of the burden. Because if you looked at prices from 10 years ago, if they had pledged 10 years ago and had, for example, invested radically in electric vehicles, this would have been very expensive, much more expensive than now. So I believe many countries think that too. They say, well, we're going to commit as soon as prices go down even further, because then we will have a more realistic picture of how much of a burden, how much of a cost this is really going to be. And also, well, we are not the worst ones. This is a classic argument. We are not the ones who have been emitting most of the greenhouse gases in the last century. Those who have been emitting more should be the ones to commit first and pledge first. And that's actually why the EU went forward too, because they were like, we see this as part of, as a historic, a debt kind, so to speak, towards the rest of the world that we're trying to pay back.
Thank you for that. And thank you again, Isabella. You've given us such a great insight on how important tech diplomacy is in addressing climate change and how diplomats and technologies are working so closely together. I'm already looking forward to our next Zoom on tech diplomacy in another area, namely AI. And thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you.